In 1973, there was a robbery that took place in the city of Stockholm, Sweden. In the course of this crime, the robbers took 4 hostages who were eventually released unharmed. But the public, and especially the media, were particularly puzzled by how these hostages reacted in the aftermath. They defended their captors and actually eventually refused to testify against them when they were put on trial. And for many people, this reaction was irrational, and they decided that it must be some form of insanity. They called it the Stockholm Syndrome. And that is a term that is often taken out and applied to similar situations to this day. Stockholm Syndrome is defined as a condition where hostages develop a psychological bond with their captors in the course of their captivity. Journalists love to talk about the Stockholm Syndrome, especially when they report on stories of hostages. But the fact of the matter is that psychologists are actually skeptical that such a syndrome really exists. And in fact, a closer look at the events that took place in Stockholm in 1973 inspires many doubts. You see, it turns out that those hostages in that ill-fated robbery were probably more upset with the police than they were in love with their captors. They were actually angry at how callously the police had acted, how they had actually endangered the hostages' lives. And that probably had more to do with their refusal to testify than any love for the robbers. But the idea of Stockholm Syndrome remains a very powerful one. A very similar thing is often proposed in discussions about slavery, both as it existed in the ancient world and in pre-Civil War American South. Slaves loved and were devoted to their masters. The protest is often made. Surely that's an indication that slavery wasn't all that bad. But I suspect that just as in that case, in that robbery in Stockholm, if you look closely at that whole matter of slaves loving their masters, was probably not quite so simple as that. So let's do that. Let's take a close look at one of my favorite stories of a slave who did something apparently out of love for her master. Abria woke up screaming. It had been the same nightmare. It was always the same nightmare. In her dreams, the Arameans would come again and again. They would come storming into her village in the middle of the day. They came with no warning, and the villagers had had no opportunity to prepare themselves. Abria herself had been out of the house, fetching some water from the well. She would never see her home or her family again. The men came upon her and 2 other girls at the well. Before they even knew what was happening, they had their hands bound together and they were unceremoniously dumped into the back of an ox cart. Later in the day, she and the others were taken out of the cart and placed before the raiders as they celebrated their victory. They were dividing up the spoils, each one claiming a share of the livestock and fruits and grains that they had seized. And Abria had no illusions that she was just another piece of plunder to them. As she stood there in a ripped tunic, all on display before all of these leering men, they suddenly fell silent as one man strode forward. He stood before the others with an air of authority and power. There was no question. He was the leader of the raiding party. And Abria knew right away that he could be none other than Naaman. Naaman, a fighter so cruel, so effective, that he had become a boogeyman to the people of Israel. Yeah. Parents would warn their children when they put them to bed at night that if they didn't settle down and go to sleep, that Naaman would come and would get them and take them away. And yet here, now, the boogeyman was as real could be. He had finally come for her. And Abria cried out in her sleep, cried out to her parents, yelling that she was sorry, that she would be a better girl in the future. And she woke up to discover that her parents were gone. She would never see them again. Naaman did take Abria as his plunder for the day's work. It was indeed a chieftain's share. He took her home and gave her to his wife to be a servant. And so Abria found herself subjected to endless toil in the kitchen and in the house. Naaman was everything she had expected him to be. He was cruel and self-absorbed. There was a haughtiness to him. He seemed to think that anything Aramean was better than anything anywhere else. The rivers of Aram were better than any other streams. The food of his land was superior to what anyone else ate. As a result of this attitude, because she was an Israelite, Naaman treated Abria as if she were an imbecile. He was rude and crude to her, certainly never cared about her feelings, because, as far as he was concerned, she was little better than an animal. She didn't have human feelings. So, life was far from easy in Naaman's household. But then it became worse. Naaman came home one day from a raid, and something was terribly wrong. The skin on his arms and his back and his legs was red and swollen, and he scratched it until it bled. If she thought life had been difficult before, now it became unbearable. Naaman, in constant pain and discomfort, was stripped away of any patience, any sympathy he had ever had. Abria was often the one who was closest when the rages would hit him. She was the one he could attack without consequence. And so her life of a common slave, the life that she had once had in this household, suddenly seemed like a lost dream. She began to dream of escaping, running away to her homeland. But she knew that escape was impossible. Whenever she found a few moments of respite in her miserable life, or when she would lay awake in her bed at night, too afraid to sleep for fear of the nightmares, Abria tried to comfort herself with memories of home. She told herself the stories that her parents had once told her, stories of Abraham and Moses. And she particularly took comfort from another set of stories, popular stories that had been told in her village about the prophets, especially the prophets Elijah and Elisha. Oh yeah, people eagerly told those tales. They were exciting. And the best part was that these men were still alive. They might any day pass through the village. So Abria also had always felt as if these men were her protectors, or at least that they would be if they were given the chance. Again and again, these incredible prophets had taken on the enemies of Israel, including the Arameans. And they had triumphed in surprising and fantastic ways. Why, it was even said that once Elisha had defeated an entire Aramean army by striking them blind and leading them into a trap. Abria began to dream of the possibility that Elisha, who was still living last she had heard, might find out about her plight and come and save her. And finding even such a small reason to hope, no matter how unlikely in her salvation, Abria found that she could not stop thinking about the possibility, which also meant she couldn't stop talking about it. And so she began to talk to the other slaves in the household about how Elisha was going to come and save her, how maybe he could help them too. And one day, she even spoke to her mistress. She came upon her in an unguarded moment in her chambers and found her weeping. That was when she realized that though she had the status of wife and free woman, that in some ways her mistress was no less a captive in this household than she was. Her mistress was not being spared the cruelty of Naaman that he could often dole out when he was caught up in his pain and suffering. And so Abria tried to speak to her mistress. She tried to find something she could say that could bring her some comfort. "Oh," she said, "if only my Lord were with the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy. And then perhaps you would find some peace." Much to her surprise, Abria's comment caused quite a stir in the household. Naaman and his wife were actually getting pretty desperate. And so she went running to her husband immediately with what she had heard. And if Naaman had a hard time believing that anything worthwhile could come from Israel to help him, he was at least desperate enough to follow up on what he had heard. Oh, he did it in a way very typical to him. He was arrogant and demanding. He put the king of Israel in a very compromising position that the prophet Elisha had to save him from. And then, when the prophet told him he had to bathe in a filthy Israelite river in order to become clean, he kind of lost it. But then something happened. Something broke through to Naaman and he was healed. But in many ways, the biggest miracle wasn't that his skin condition was cured. No, the biggest miracle as far as Abria and the rest of the household were concerned was that something had finally broken through his arrogance. The arrogance that Naaman carried in his heart. Naaman returned to the household with 2 mule loads of soil that he had collected in the land of Israel. You see, he understood. Everyone understood that certain gods belong to certain places. And you could only worship a god in the place that belonged to that god. So, Naaman had decided that now he was going to worship Yahweh, the God of Israel, who had healed him of his skin condition. So he had brought back with him a little bit of the land of Israel so he could set up an altar to worship the God of Israel. I wish I could tell you that after he returned, Naaman was kind and gentle towards Abria and the others in the household. Many things didn't change. He continued to be a fearsome war leader and raider. He sometimes seemed to have forgotten the lesson he had learned, that people in other places actually might know some things, have things of value. His old arrogance still sometimes shone through. But there were times when he would look at Abria and remember to consider the possibility that even though she was an Israelite, she might know a few things about the world. The life of a slave remained the life of a slave. Abria didn't find her labors or her fears lightened. But I will say that her nightmares got better for one reason at least. She actually had an opportunity to worship when Naaman worshipped on his little piece of Israelite soil that he had brought back. And so in that place, she was able to find a connection to her home and to the God who had felt so far away. And that did bring her some comfort. I remember hearing the story of the slave girl who served Naaman's wife all the way back in my Sunday school days. I remember, too, how we were told to read and understand the story. The little girl, who of course doesn't have a name in the Bible, I had to give her a name just to tell her story. The little girl is held up as an example of a perfect evangelist. She is lauded as someone who did what we are all supposed to do and tell other people about Jesus. And on one level, I don't have a problem with the idea that, we should be willing to share with others how our faith in Jesus has helped us in this life. I don't really appreciate how some people do it in imposing or coercive ways, but sharing honestly something that has really helped you in your life with someone else, that's a gift that we should be willing to do. But I would suggest that if that's all you get from the story, there is actually a bit of a problem. Christian tradition, you see, has this history of putting people who have been victimized in various ways into a position where they feel this obligation to endure suffering without complaint in service to the gospel. And that has led to some really dark things. There are too many stories of abused women who were told to remain in their abusive marriages as a gospel witness. There are too many stories of people who've been victimized by the church in some way, who are then forced to remain quiet in order to not damage the witness of the church. I must say that that is wrong, just plain wrong. It is the opposite of a good witness. So no, I am not willing to read the story of this girl in any way that minimizes the trauma and abuse that a captive would have lived through at that time. Any simplistic understanding of that story who turns her into a sufferer from Stockholm Syndrome, someone who only loves her masters, is, I think, a failure to struggle with a very dark history. I have to read her story as her doing whatever she can to hold on to her identity, doing whatever she can to save herself in a horrible situation. That's something we all need to do. Now, if God does manage to bring something out of good, something good out of a horrible situation for ourselves or for someone else, that's the amazing God we have. That's wonderful. But none of that should ever be taken to mean that it is God's desire or will that anyone be a victim or that anyone tolerate abuse. That's not the kind of God we have. And I think that needs to be said. Lord, we pray for the victims in this world. There are too many. Save them. Use us if you can. Amen.